Maintaining living plant cover is one of the essential practices of building soil health. This talk will provide practical guidance on using cover crops in a small-scale, non-mechanized, no-till context to improve soil health, both for growing more nutritious food and for sequestering atmospheric carbon into the soil to help heal climate change. Our speaker tonight, Sharon Gensler, is a homesteader, organic grower, and educator. For more than 38 years, she has used no-till and cover crop soil building practices on a small scale. She does workshops and writes the Homestead Reflections column for the newsletter for the Northeast Organic Farming Association of Massachusetts.
Hi there, everybody. Welcome, and I want to say thank you to everybody that's made this happen for tonight. So, healthy soils, healthy gardens, healthy us. I'm going to give just a brief bio of myself so you understand where I'm coming from. And while I'm doing that, I'm going to show you a few slides from around our homestead. They'll give you a better understanding of whether you should believe what I say or not. Anyway, I grew up on a small family farm in upstate New York and couldn't wait to get out of there and go off and be a college administrator. But I couldn't keep my hands out of the soil and needed to come back and be rooted. So I wanted to be able to grow as much of my food as possible. But I realized what I grew up with, tractors and straight row farming and bare dirt, really wasn't what would make me happy. So I started reading. I read a lot of information at the time, and what really stuck was Ruth Stout, John Jevons, French intensive permanent raised beds. And I hadn't heard of permaculture, but I was working at the New England Small Farm Institute at this time that I was gifted the land that I have. And Bill Mollison, who some of you may have heard of, is one of the co-founders of the permaculture movement. And he walked around the farm with us for 5 days. And during that time, it just kind of blew my mind about how to see things, because he would be showing us something that most of us thought was an obstacle. And he would show us how it was an opportunity. For instance, a large rock that might have to spend a lot of time and break your back to move. He suggested just leave that. The birds will sit on it. And then when it rains, the bird poop will wash off and fertilize your garden. The sun will warm it up. And if you plant warm loving crops around it, you'll end up with a tempering effect on the soil and on the plants that you're growing. So luckily that happened just as I was planning and starting my garden. And it was in Wendell, which is fully rocky, very little soil where we were, totally wooded. So I started by cutting all of the trees down to soil level and working at building soil up instead of digging down and doing the double dig method I used to do and things like that. So now this is all called, then I got into doing cover crops because it just seemed like, wow, why can farmers do things like that and not us gardeners? And so between not being able to till because of the site we had, and also I couldn't afford a tractor even though I lusted after one, and because of the readings I had done and Mr. Mollison, I ended up doing something which is now called regenerative growing, regenerative agriculture. So I'm really happy that for 30, 40 years, I have built soil. And the conventional wisdom is it takes 100 years to build an inch of topsoil. And I can attest to over 12 inches of really beautiful, rich topsoil in 30 some years. So it can be done. What else can I tell you? That's about it. I'll keep moving. We're mostly vegetable and fruit, and we had poultry both for meat and for eggs, but not other major animals. This is a view out the kitchen window of the main vegetable garden. And some people looking at it would say, oh my God, what a mess. That is just such a turmoil. But there is a method to that madness that that diversity and that unkempt look is all kind of planned. Here's the same view and in early May. And just wanted to show you that the permanent beds, they're mostly 3 to 4 feet wide. The center part is a circle, but then there are rectangles coming off of it. But the only bare soil that you see in that whole photo is one bed where I've moved the mulch off so that I could start planting seeds or seedlings. I can't remember what it was. But that's one of the things we'll be talking about, is keeping your soil covered. Okay. Just an overview. Tonight we'll be talking about the macro and micro life in the soil organic carbon, and how we as farmers, gardeners, landscapers can take care of the soil and build it. A little bit about carbon sequestration, cover crops, and no-till. So how do we go from this picture on the left of really dead soil to healthy, really chocolate cake rich soil full of life? A healthy soil creates healthy plants, and healthy plants creates healthy food, whether it's and healthy animals, whether it's us as an animal or an animal we might eat. And it's just amazing what this biologically rich microbial life in the soil, the higher nutrient value of the produce, there's more vibrancy of colors and flavors and aromas. There's a decreased amount of pests and disease. And to me, a major thing is that it's decreasing the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and sequestering it in the soil. It could be 40 to 100 years. So that, when people talk about global warming, I don't talk about that. I talk about the climate crisis, because we can do something about it. Yes, it's important to stop using as much fossil fuels and do all of that, but doing things on our own, we can be one of those drops that are filling the bucket till it overflows. And by being out and being healthy and happy and loving our garden, we're also helping the earth. So just a brief carbon dioxide cycle here is, we all know this, I think, that the green things give off carbon dioxide, and us mammals breathe it in. Thank goodness we have this mutual attraction. But the part that I wanted to talk about also is that we can put carbon into the soil at a close to the surface level, where it is easy to have it go back into the atmosphere, or we can take techniques to bring it back down into the deeper levels where it is stored for many decades. What is this carbon, soil organic carbon? And that is really organic materials, anything that's organic matter that can decompose and become soil. Since the modern agriculture in this country we have lost probably 70% or more of the organic soil carbon. It is the largest pool of terrestrial carbon is in our soil. And so when you hear all of these corporations talking about, we've got to build billion-dollar facilities to take it out of the air and put it in the oceans or put it somewhere else, all we have to do is not spend as much money and put it into our soil. And tilling aerates the soil and brings the carbon dioxide closer where it can be emitted back into the atmosphere. Two of the things that really determine how we can really store this carbon is the roots of the plants and the depth of the root, how deep it goes into the soil, as well as the photosynthetic rate. And having really good photosynthesis will really kicks this whole thing into motion. And carbon is sequestered at greater depths in the no-till system, which we're going to talk about. So I saw that one of our sponsors has this slide also. It's off the internet, but I think it really shows a lot. If you keep the greenery on top of your soil, then you have a thin layer of decomposing organic matter, which is really important because that gives a lot of nutrients to the plants. But then we also have this slide shows soil aggregates, which is these little clumps and pea-shaped or sized conglomerates of soil. You see your worms, you see the roots going really, really deep. And so this is a really healthy type of soil that we all hopeful that we're aiming for. So back, I don't know, maybe 6th grade, I learned about photosynthesis, and it was just your basic, wow, plants, green things take carbon dioxide and sunlight and water, and they create sugar and all life on Earth. Well, yes, but they do so much more. These sugars also have amino acids and various chemicals and nutrients and things that the plants then manufacture, but then they also exude it. Up to 60% of what they manufacture, they exude into the roots, into the soil. And I don't know, I think about that and I think if I took 60% of what I create and gave it away, wow, it would be really hard to manage to live on that other 40%. So what are the plants gaining by giving away so much of what they've worked so hard at? And that's what we're going to talk about, because they're creating a symbiotic relationship with soil microorganisms that really enhance both the plant life and the microorganisms, and therefore us too. So most of you, I wish I was in person. I could have you all raising hands and telling me how many of you are already growers and everything. But I imagine most of you have grown or have a garden or and are interested in different techniques or something new. But if you're brand new, we'll try to hit that level too. But if you think about a really healthy soil and you take a teaspoon of it, it has billions of creatures living in it. We're going to mostly talk tonight about bacteria and fungi because that's what I know the most about. And when you think about those two things, you think, oh my gosh, they're detrimental, they're negative creatures. But actually, as in most everything in this country, I mean, this world, we have beneficials and we have things that aren't so beneficial. So we're going to try to talk about how we increase the level of beneficials, because these microorganisms take nutrients and turn them into a form that is bioavailable to the plant, because you could have plenty of minerals right around your plant root. You could have a soil test and it says you have a lot of phosphorus, you have a lot of phosphate, you have a lot of nitrogen, but why is your plant just not doing well? It's because those things aren't available in a form that the plant can take up and make use of. So what changes those things, either the things you buy and put on your soil, or hopefully we'll all get to the point where we can just use the fungus to take subsoil and create these nutrients that are available to your plants, and you're not having to pay for inputs. So most microbes, well, they all need carbon to live, and that's what we're going to talk about. It's all part of this carbon cycle. And let's get into some more detail here. So this is just a funny little picture of to show that on the far left, you have some soil cut out with a little bit of greenery and very few roots. And as you move towards the right, you see much more green growing above. Well, it's gray, I know, but let's make believe it's green. And then you see that root mass under, because there's more green, there's more photosynthesis, there's more roots, and they're giving off more of these little cakes and cookies and sugars and amino acids and things to the soil microbes. And bacteria, they're one of our main decomposers along with the fungi, and we really need them or else we'd be buried under debris. They do so many things for us. And, you know, I know this culture is just hooked on antibiotics, and we're going to try to shift that when we're talking about our soil and not have antibiotics, but have probiotics going. So one of the things, they do all kinds of good things. They fix nitrogen, they synthesize hormones, they produce fungicides for bad fungus, and they work with the plant on demand for what they are needed, for what the plant needs. just for an example of a beneficial bacteria is the Rhizobium family, which they fix nitrogen. So our atmosphere has a huge percent nitrogen component, yet so many of us go out and buy a fertilizer that has nitrogen in it to feed our plants. Whereas if we remember, I bet many of you have gotten those little inoculant packets. So when then you plant beans or peas, that you put this little black powder all over it and then you plant it. Now, I did that for years. I'm going, well, they say to do it, but I never really understood what it was about. What it's about is that you're putting this bacteria right at the seed, so it's in the soil, and that bacteria takes nitrogen out of the atmosphere and fixes it into the plant root. So we love them. And the other creatures that we really love a lot are the fungi, and we're really lucky because where we live, the temperate zone, we have an abundance of beneficial fungi. So when you look at this little pine seedling, when I first saw it, I thought, oh my gosh, look at the amount of root hairs that plant has for being so tiny. In actuality, all of those little filaments are mycorrhizal fungi, mycelium. And the root is actually the golden colored, thicker, directly under the pine seedling itself. So to me, that looks like, if I had to visualize what the internet might look like with all of connections and everything, it's kind of, in my brain, looks like that. It kind of looks like my brain too. So that's one little plant. And then you have another plant and another plant, because there's rarely just one plant growing by itself. And then you have all of those mycelia interacting. They grow into the roots, and through the roots, they interact and grow through each other. And this whole network is a network of communication and transportation. And so the symbiotic relationship with that green living plant is so important to have, because the nutrients right around the small root, or even if they had more rootlets, is very limited. But if that plant communicates to the through the chemicals that it exudes through its roots, it communicates to those mycelium, hey, I need some boron. And the myceliums communicate that through their network and through the networks that they're all entangled with. And the transportation part of the network brings that boron back in a form that the plant is able to use and take up. And so it's so complex. It's so amazing. And many years ago, I read The Secret Life of Plants, and it started talking about a lot of this. And now there's so much research about how trees communicate over great distances and how plants help each other with their communication system. So I want to move along, but I would like to ask you to try to retain that picture in your mind for a little while, because I want to talk about it in relation to other things in a minute. So this is just a tip of a root, and it shows a mycelium again, how they're growing right through that root, and how many times, 10 to 100 times, it increases the ability of that root to absorb nutrients. The other thing that fungi and bacteria help produce is a substance called glomalin, which I had never heard of, and probably many people hadn't. But it's it's really essential for healthy soil. It's the glue that binds soil particles together. If you think of heavy clay soil, it's like compact, and it's really dense, and it's hard to get roots or water or air through it. Or sand, on the other hand, is so light that everything just goes right through it, and nothing is held near the plant roots. So we want this glue to take soil particles and stick them together into an aggregate. And that's what in this picture on the left, you can see a little bit of how things are clumped together. And if you were to pull a plant out of healthy soil and shake it, all the soil wouldn't fall off. You'd still have a lot of soil clinging to it, and that's that glue that's clinging it to the roots. The other important thing about that glue is that that's where carbon can be stored and sequestered for the long haul, because it's just really contained. And the aggregates become homes and hiding places for the soil microorganisms, so they're not eaten up by bigger organisms. It's a microorganism world out there. So how do we want to manage our soil to make it the best way to encourage all of those things? So I'm not going to read all of this. We're just going to go talk about it. This is my diversity cake. And I like to think of soil as layers where everybody has their own special place that they can do their best. They can really grow and really function at their highest level. So you take a 2-year-old to that birthday cake and just smashes it, and you think, oh my gosh, everybody has to get back home, and it's going to take them a long time. And this is where I want you to think of that picture of the pine tree with all of that mycorrhizal network, and visualize that also being part of this soil picture. And you see this nice greenery covering the whole top, and then really deep, dark soil with very long, deep roots. And we can't see it because it's not under a microscope, but the mycorrhizae is probably just like really intense in that. Now, if you take a rototiller, you take your plow, you take your spade, and you start turning that soil, what happens to that network? What happens? I like to compare it to a tornado going through a community. Somebody could be killed or injured, the houses and structures are destroyed, the communications network and transportation network, water, sewage, everything is disrupted or destroyed. So we just talked about those mycorrhizal being transportation and communication and having this symbiosis. So if we really want that healthy soil, we don't want to make it so that it takes forever. Those people in Alabama, if you saw those pictures, it was just heart-rending. And it's going to take them a long time to get their communities back to a functioning, healthy community. And we want to keep our soil communities healthy and functioning all the time without having to make them struggle. And I want to say that when you're starting to go to no-till, it may be hard because some of us are really wedded to those tillers. But take a small section of your garden and try some of these techniques. And I betcha after a year or two, a couple of seasons, you'll see such tremendous improvement in your soil and in your crops that you'll want to do more. And you may be starting with a piece of land that you really feel like you need to till to get started. And, so we do what we can do. So I call it no-till, minimum till. It's do what you can do to minimize that impact on the soil. So there are a lot of benefits, and I'm not going to read them all right now, but it really takes that, so it improves that soil structure and keeps it there so that you're always adding to it instead of taking away from it. One thing that I hadn't thought of until I started seeing it and then I read about it is weed suppression, because normally there's a lot of weed seeds that's dormant deep in the soil, but when you till, you're bringing them up, giving them the opportunity to germinate and grow. You have such amazing erosion control and water retention with nice aerated deep soil. You want soil that looks like chocolate cake, and when you take a handful of it, it feels like a damp sponge, and it's not soggy and it's not dry. And this is what this kind of soil health will give you, as well as sequestering that carbon. So how do you do that? Well, I started building things up, and so I didn't have a whole lot of weed in the beginning, but if you have really light, small, tender leaves, weeds or whatever, you could do something called solarization, which is putting a piece of clear plastic on top of the soil and on a hot sunny day, and it'll fry everybody, and you don't want to leave it on over 48 hours or you'll fry your microbes. And not being a petrochemical person, I've only done this once, and that's for this slideshow. But it is a method that can be used so that you're not tilling the soil. Or you can just lightly scuffle the top inch or two, and you're not destroying that whole mycorrhizal network down below. Another for bigger weeds or older weeds is you can put occultation, which just means keeping the sun off of it and moisture. Again, this is off the internet and it's black plastic. Just wanted to show you how to keep your soil dark, but I would really recommend cardboard. Besides doing all of these good things, it also is a worm factory, and we all know how much good healthy earthworms help our soil. So then now there's this, they call it the lasagna method, and that's basically how I started doing my permaculture method. In this picture on the left, do not do this. It's just like this would be for somebody who's just like crazed to do something that much. Do 6 or 8 inches of a manure and then 6 or 8 inches of a wood chip or of hay or something, instead of all these like micro layers. But what you wanted to do is layer down organic matter that will rot and become soil. And shredded leaves are really good, well-rotted manure, compost. But your top layer you want to have is something that covers it and keeps that whole layer cake moist. So you don't want to put compost on your top layer because it will dry out. So wood chips or straw or something like that. And before you can plant in it, it's composting, so it's going to be hot. So you should wait 6 months. But when I did my garden, I couldn't wait, so I just moved things aside and made a little planting hole and put compost in it, or made a little trench and put seeds in it, and things grew. And immediately that first season. And the other major thing is mulching for a no-till system. Mulch, mulch, mulch. And you ever can find an old Ruth Stout book, she's the queen of mulching. It does, it keeps the soil moist, it moderates your temperature, it suppresses weeds. And again, it's keeping the soil covered, so carbon dioxide is not just going up into the atmosphere. When you have the green layer right there, any carbon dioxide that is being outgassed by the earth itself, by the soil, has green leaves right there to breathe it back in. And so you've got just like an in-breath and an out-breath going between the earth and the green layer. So what kind of tools for no-till if we're not going to use our tiller? A broad fork is a really handy thing. When you're layering up beds, it doesn't really work. I started using it after my layers started shrinking. And every year I would add more mulch, but still, and I was trying to get down into the subsoil a little bit, because I put my layers right over the trees, stumps, right over the rocks, whatever was there, and came up. And so that did need a little aeration and loosening over time. If you don't have a broad fork, because they're pricey, just a garden fork or whatever. But again, just rock it and loosen. You're not in the business of turning. So cover crops. Now, I love cover crops too. And somebody goes, well, if you can only do one, which would you do? And it's not, I can't do an either or on it, because they go so hand in hand. They're just so beneficial to each other that I just urge you to try a little bit of it, and we'll see. So folks say, well, what's the difference between a cover crop and a green manure? And basically the only difference is how they're used. And a green manure, if you really need a hit of fertilizer, of nitrogen especially, then that's what you want to do. And you'll see the farmers in the valley a lot will have, at this time of year, you'll see the green starting to come up because they put something in, usually a winter rye, and it will come back up in the spring. And but all the cover crops that I'm going to talk to you about are only ones that will be winter killed, because some people might call it lazy, but I know my limits. And if it's going to be something that I have to kill, then I might not do it at the exact time that it has to happen. And then it becomes a weed and it becomes a problem. So I'll talk more about that in a minute. But for a green manure, seeing we're not tilling in the valley, those farmers will till that green manure under. before they plant. What we'll do is cut it at soil level. And then if you wanted to, you could put that plastic on it, or you could just leave it to decompose on the soil. And that will give you your hit of nitrogen. So the cover crop, now the cover crop is really that's what we want for long-term, really investing in our soil. It's like putting money in the bank for our retirement, but our retirement is going to be next year. It's just really, or even later this year sometimes. So we just want it to do as much growing as it can, as much photosynthesizing, putting good nutrients back into the soil, and its roots going really deep so it can deposit the carbon deeper into the soil. And as it gets older, it gets more lignin in it, because it's the lignin that holds the stalks up. It's what makes a tree be a tree and be able to stand upright. And that's really what the fungus is the lignin. So the more of that we have available, the more the fungus will be able to have nutrients. So here's the benefit of cover crops. And I'm not going to read them all because they're almost identical to those of the no-till. One thing that's different is that it produces biomass for you. So if you want greenery to add to your compost pile, or if you need more mulch, you can just keep growing them and cutting them and using them as a biomass. And some of them can be used as a living mulch, which I'll go into in a minute. The other one is that pest and disease control is really increased, and carbon sequestration. So now this photo, again, it's from the internet, but when I saw it, I thought I've got to take this one because it shows, like on the left, really a massive amount of roots for a small plant above. That's what we really want. We want those roots. And on the right, this one reminded me of when one of the reasons I started thinking of no-till too was one year I didn't get my garden put to bed in the fall. And I know you all probably got yours all ready, and I went out in the spring and there were those big stalks from the broccoli, and I pulled one up, and besides soil falling off it, just worms were falling off it like crazy. So I started thinking, well, why is this? What's going on? And I realized that the rotting roots would feed for those worms all winter long, were food. And the same for the microorganisms. Those that survive the winter need food. So those roots left in the ground serve that purpose. But they also, every time you pull a plant up, you're disrupting that whole mycorrhizal community, and you're disrupting your soil structure. The other thing about this is that white root structure that you see, somebody either cut that off or it died from winter, and that root is all decomposed in there. And besides being a pathway for air and water, it's also a pathway. It makes it easier for other plant roots to go down deep, and they're getting the nutrients from those rotting roots. And, just a schematic, but our artist's rendering of the soil, but that also shows your aggregate, which, so where do I use these cover crops? Pretty much anywhere I can. So the picture on the left, I had about an 18-inch space at the end of a bed of onions that I had planted. And so I put in a little mix of cover crop seeds there. And about 2 weeks later, there they are, 6-8 inches tall. They're covering the soil, they're photosynthesizing, they're doing all those benefits we talked about, keeping the soil nice and moist. And they're close enough that the mycorrhizal activity can go into the onions. It's really good if you can to let some of these cover crops go in a bed for the full year. Now, taking out, depending on the size of your garden, that may be impossible. So if you can take out just a couple foot square, that would be really good too. When I started growing cover crops, I just took out a little bit, but over time, my soil was getting so much better that now I get more produce from less square foot of garden than I used to. So I can take out 1/4 to 1/3 of my beds and have them in cover crops and still get the same amount of food. So it's a good deal. So just a quick fast through. This is some cover crops growing, a mixture, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And here it is in September on the right, and it's about 4 or 5 feet tall there. And October, it was above my head, so that's about 6 feet tall. And on the left, I mean, and on the right, like I said, I only plant ones that will winter kill. And so after maybe 3 or 4 nights of 20 degrees, things died back. And here's that same bed in December. I didn't have to bring in anything to mulch that bed. I didn't have to do any work. It died in place. It's about 12 inches deep. I live near the woods, so the stubble caught the leaves and made it even deeper and richer mulch for the winter. And the picture on the right just shows forage radish, which we'll talk about, which isn't part of the cover crop. And that will die later, but see the size of that root and how much nutrient is in the soil when it's rotting and decomposing, and the worms will eat on that one. Another way to use them is to sow before your main crop. I usually put my hot loving things in June. And so from mid to late April, depending on how our climate is changing, I can put oats and peas, because they are cold hardy, into the ground. I put some in last week. I don't know if they'll germinate because of the weather, but I thought it was worth a risk. When they germinate, by the time I plant my heat-loving crops, they'll have 2 months of photosynthesizing, feeding the soil, keeping it covered, and then when I cut it, it becomes the mulch from around that where I put around the plant. So I just cut back below the soil line, which I'll talk about in a minute too, and scooch back and plop the plant in. Here's some friends harvesting garlic with me. It's the end of July, the very end. Either that same day or the next day, I get a cover crop into that same bed. And here it is at the end of August. So that's a month of growth. That's probably 18 inches tall. And we'll get back and show more those slides that I showed you that were 6 feet tall and before they were killed. That's that same bed. So you got that much growth from planting it at the end of July, the beginning of August. I swear this year I'll replace this slide. It's a terrible slide. You would not undersow under carrots, but undersowing is another really good way to blow your mind and think about things really different and try to shift the paradigm from competition to cooperation. And normally, if you think you don't want anything around your plant growing because it's going to steal the sunlight, it's going to steal the nutrients, it's just bad to have anything near your vegetable. But in actuality, if you wait until your, say, corn is a third of the way through its growing maturity cycle, and you plant your cover crop under it, and by the time it germinates and starts to grow, your corn is way too tall for any competition for them to be competing for sun. And they're photosynthesizing, so they're feeding the corn, they're keeping the soil moisture wet. So it's a cooperation. It's not a competition. Now, if you planted it too soon and they covered them, then yeah, it would be a problem. But some of these things are just so different than what I grew up with and what conventional wisdom says. Conventional thought, anyway. I don't know about wisdom. So I'm going to go through these seeding techniques. So when you think of broadcasting, you think you're out in 40 acres and just throwing the seed. Well, we're not doing that. We're just taking the seed and sprinkling it a little bit around. And this is in April when the ground is frost seeding. So if I want to try to do some frost seeding, I'll pull the mulch back that I've had on all winter. And you get those fissures where you see the pretty ice crystals. If you sprinkle your oats and peas in at this point, the up and downing of the frost heaving will plant it for you so you don't have to rake it. Another way to make life easier. So this is one of the beds that had 12 inches of mulch in the fall, and now it's down to about, an inch maybe or two. And you can just sprinkle the seeds over the top of that mulch, take your rake and shuffle it in. Cover crop seeds are just like anything else. They have to touch soil. But they don't have to be buried in it as long as they're touching the soil and the mulch is over the top of them. And then if it's rainy season, you don't have to worry, but if it's dry, you need to water them. Another way is to have your cover crop, that same stuff was just going through the mulch. I planted that thinly and it came up not as a really thick crop. And then I just smashed it down with a board. It's called crimping. And then you're not killing all of it, but you're delaying its being able to grow because its vascular system has been crimped over. And then I planted winter squash starts in it in June. Here it is in July. They're growing through it. And then here it is at the end of July on the right. And you can see those little white flowers and these oat seeds. Those are the cover crops are starting to come up back through it. But again, not enough to compete, but enough to help. Another way I really like to use cover crops, especially buckwheat, is around crops that like lettuce and things that bolt really easy. It'll help the shade they produce will help give you another week or 2 weeks of eating sweet lettuce without having it bolt. It's also good for preventing sun scald, like on peppers and things. So this was just an experiment. You know, I'm buying cover crop seed, but I've got garden sorrel and chickweed that I like to grow to give to the chickens. So I'm saying, well, that's covering the ground. It's photosynthesizing. So I'm experimenting with it and it worked really well. I had to cut it back a couple times, but I also cut back the cover crops. So try doing fun things and see what works for you. All right, I'm going to go through each of these. So oats and peas, I've already said a little bit about them. They're really cold hardy, so you could plant them now and they'll last a little bit longer in the fall. All of these things are really good and do different things. And so in a minute, we'll talk about cover crop cocktail and the diversity, the more diverse, the better. This is buckwheat and it's frost sensitive. So you don't want to plant that until June. And it really attracts beneficial insects and the wide leaves really prevent holding the moisture and are good at weed suppression. If you've got a really problematic area with a lot of weeds, just plant buckwheat over and over again and it'll get rid of them. I can walk out there and just stand when they're in flower and it's like you're in I don't know what, the whole place is just buzzing like crazy. And I've seen insects, I have no idea what they are. They're so tiny. And that's why it's a really good beneficial habitat. And I try to plant at least a little bit of buckwheat every 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks, so that there's always some in bloom for this habitat. Because if you've got aphids and your ladybugs go and wipe out your aphids, then they look around and there's nothing else for them to eat. They're going to go to your neighbors. Whereas if they've got some little flowers like buckwheat or Queen Anne's lace or things like that, then they have a habitat where they can go and eat nectar and wait until your next outbreak of pest. All right, so sorghum, Sudan grass. It's called a grass, but it's much more like a corn, a really wide leaf, and it has roots like a corn. One of the things about it is that it just is amazing biomass producer. So if you really need compost or mulch, just have some of that growing that you're constantly cutting and putting into your mulch. It also suppresses root knot nematodes. And so I always have it in the year before I'm going to plant carrots the following year in that bed. And it really, really does help keep them down. And here's those radishes again. And they're basically daikons. And a lot of times I don't have a daikon when I want to make some kimchi. So I go out and steal some of my cover crop. I also eat the tips of the growing on the peas, the field peas. I eat the tips of those. They're really good in salads. They're great as a stir fry. So it's not like you're wasting that bed. The oat straw you can make a nice tea out of. So a lot of these things are edible as well as doing good work for you. So if you've got a really compact soil, that daikon will break through it and help get air and moisture down through it. And they're amazing types of things. So now I've told you I only plant things that winter kill. And I'm going to tell you that's not quite true, because I do plant clover, white Dutch clover, which is low growing, and a red medium clover has come and self-seeded in my garden, and now it goes wherever it wants to go, and I just let it. Anyway, they are such amazing nitrogen fixers. I have them on the sides of beds and in the pathways. And then if it starts being where I don't want it, I just use that tool I'll show you in a minute to cut it back and move it out of where I want to be growing. But the amount of nitrogen they fix is amazing. And you can also just plant through it as a living mulch. And this is the red clover, and also has very big tap roots that break up compaction. And it's a biennial, so it will self-seed. This on the left is a red clover root that I pulled in April, the end of April, and there was hardly any greenery on top yet. And so you can just see there's a lot of glomalin on those roots, but there aren't. On the right hand, you can see it's a little fuzzy, the picture, but those little nodes that look like little bubbles, those are the nitrogen sacs that plant, because in August it had a lot of green top, and it just, pulled nitrogen out of the atmosphere and put it there so that it's going to be available to growing plants. So the cover crop cocktail idea is just to mix things together, and some farmers are doing 19, 20, whatever, 30, as much as they can. But I'm going to repeat, because it's really important for me, is I don't want to create a problem for myself. So besides the clover, what I try to mix are things that will winter kill. And you have the oats, the peas, the buckwheat, forage, radish, barley, sorghum, sunflowers. If I have old, outdated vegetable seeds, corn, or whatever, I throw it all in. And I've just read about crimson clover and sun hemp, and I might try to do those this year, but try to get as many things as you can, because some years it'll be dry and some of those will do better, and other years it'll be wet and somebody else will do better. Some roots go deep, some roots are shallow, so the diversity gives your soil the most opportunity to. I'm going to go through these. How do I manage them? Because they're growing. So this little tool, I wish I got a commission from the orchard equipment supply company over in Conway. It's a Japanese tool. It's really lightweight. It has a serrated sickle cutting bar, and I cut everything with that. I can cut it above the greenery just to put it down as a mulch. I can go below the soil line, and it lasts years and years without getting dull. And just a picture out the window, again, mulched, and then the snow. The snow is also a really good time for fertilizer to set in. See if I run through this quickly. Just again, this area was sown in August, and then that had that 12 inches of mulch, and here it is in the spring, and there's hardly any mulch left, because it just didn't disappear into the atmosphere. It's been feeding the soil. It's been creating new soil for you, even in the winter. And there's that same picture, but that came from this bed of just looking how rich that soil is after that cover crop. So I plant my carrots in July. And so from April till July is a nice long time. So I plant a whole mix. I start with the oats and peas, actually, because I want it in August. And I do the frost seeding, and here they are germinating. I'm going through this fast, and here in June, the end of June, it's probably about 3 feet tall, beautiful, thick bed. I really planted it thickly. Here I am cutting it. There's the blade of that tool. Take a look at that soil right there. You just want to eat it. It looks like chocolate cake to me, and it's worm castings and just beautiful, rich. And I did pull up 2 of the peas plants just to show you. And again, there's all those little nodules. That's all nitrogen. So by cutting that plant off, the nitrogen that was in that plant root is going to go into the soil and be available for the next thing. I laid down the plants that I cut right on top of the bed, and then it dried out, and I made nice, beautiful mulch. I use the digger just because I'm doing it this slideshow, and I wanted to show you also truth in advertising. This kind of gardening does encourage voles. So I had voles in this bed, and I wanted to do carrots, so I wanted to encourage them to move along. Just a few pictures of the soil. And I wanted this on purpose. I didn't cover it because I wanted to see some germination of weeds so that I could solarize. You could see there weren't that many weeds, but I did this anyway. And then in the foreground are beets, and then there's carrots in the back. When they got about 4 inches tall, I did mulch between the rows of the carrots, and well, actually about 2 inches tall. And then once they get going and they self-mulch, that was all I had to do to that bed. And there they are. So sometimes I also do some feeding of the by using a foliar spray. And there's I don't have an exact recipe. There are recipes in books that you can read, but I didn't have a picture of the backpack sprayer in the garden, but this is my partner in the orchard. She does the fruit, I do the vegetables. But I take a bucket, 4 or 5 gallon bucket, fill it with as many vibrant weeds and herbs as I have, especially comfrey and nettles and vetch and clover and that oat grass and whatever. And the growing tips of really healthy weeds are excellent. Cover it with water, let it sit a day or two, and then strain it and put some liquid fish and liquid seed in it, and spray your plant. It gives them a nutrient boost if they need it, especially while you're waiting for the soil microorganisms to expand as the weather warms up. But it also covers the leaves with a beneficial array of bacteria and all kinds of things, so that when disease comes, there's already a colony in place, so that there's no room for the disease to come. You might be starting with poor or depleted soil, and so you might need to have to do some adding. And because I didn't know about mycorrhizae and everything when I started, I did add a bunch of minerals because my soil tests kept coming up that I was missing things to get to a balance. And once you hit some kind of balance, where there is a bioavailable nutrient source, I haven't added minerals to the soil since then. You can also go out into a wooded area and see under some really healthy trees and move the top leaves aside and take a handful or two from various spots and bring that nice dark black leaf mold home and put that in little spots in the garden to inoculate your soil. Or you could put it in that compost tea, and when you spray, you're inoculating, and just spray the soil as well as the crops. Cover cropping intensively and adding your compost and your ligneous mulch. I have used wood chips for mulch for 40 years, and people have always said, you can't do that, you can't do that, you can't do that. If you're not mixing it into the soil, if you mix it into the soil, yes, it takes nutrients from the soil to decompose it. But if it's just on top, it's always being decomposed from underneath by your soil creatures, and then it's going into the soil as a nutrient. And I swear by them, especially if you can get hardwood chips. If you have the money and want to buy some of these inoculants, there are millions on the market, and some of them are really expensive. Michael Phillips, who's an organic orchard guy up in New Hampshire, has written a book, Mycorrhizal Planet, which is excellent. I recommend it, as well as his orcharding books. But he lists ones that he did some tests of which ones he thinks are worth, if you're going to buy them, are worth the money rather than spending money on ones that aren't that great. So I have a bunch of resources here. This is if you need to know how many handfuls or pounds or cups or whatever of cover crop I need. This is a chart from Cornell. I just go by my gut of, I want a thick crop and it's cold out, I put a lot of seeds. I want a thick crop and it's August and it's going to come up, I put less seeds. And then during the pandemic, what have I been doing? I've been looking at agricultural videos, and there's a lot on regeneration so there's a bunch of here. I didn't watch all of them. Some of them I skimmed, but there's some really nice resources. And one of the biggest resources back in the very beginning, I should have mentioned about the soil carbon, is NOFAMAS. We have a huge amount of resources in videos and audios and reading all about soil carbon and sequestration. And so go there and save your energy of looking yourself. Okay, I'm gonna end. I only have 2 more minutes. Don't cut me off yet. But this picture I love. It is this tomato plant. You can see it was in October 11th, a couple of years ago. But I don't know. I used to have tomato plants, and when you see them everywhere, the bottom by July, August, the bottom 2 feet, 3 feet starts going up the plant is yellow, brown, dead. And why is that happening? Why is that happening? Look at this plant. It's not happening. So why is that? Why is it not happening? And the reason is because the bacteria that decays dead and dying leaves is doing its job. Its job is to decay dead and dying leaves. And why were those bottom leaves dying? Is because the plant really wants its progeny to live on. So it's taking if you don't have enough nutrients in that plant, and the soil doesn't have it to give to the plant, it takes it from the bottom leaves and moves it up to the top leaves and to the fruit. It wants those fruit to ripen and be mature. So feed the fruit, feed the new leaves, and take from the bottom leaves. So as they're being drained of their nutrients, then the bacteria move in and decompose it. But if you have enough nutrients in your soil and you give them a spray now and then, that all goes away. So I hope you think about this stuff, and maybe there's something you'll want to do, and you can make a note and jot it down, share it with your friends, send me an email. This is just one of my friends in the cover crop, that if you're not using toxins and you're having a nice healthy biodiversity. All right, questions?
All right, so I'm going to begin with someone who's starting new beds is asking, is planting cover crops for the first year a good way to start?
Well, I guess I would say it depends on how much space you have. So if I'm starting a new bed, new garden, I would start with the cardboard and the mulching up, building upward for soil. And I might not have a lot of space, but if I had a bed to do, I would definitely throw them in. I started a new bed, Truth in Advertising, that whole beautiful homestead. I just moved out of it and moved up the hill because of my aging body. I'm starting from scratch, and I started new beds in the fall, and I put cover crop seed on immediately, and they were about 18 inches tall, planted in September before they killed, and they grew. So yes.
Great. So you plant something in every bed every season?
I have my vegetables in some beds, and I have cover crops in the beds that I don't have any vegetables in, and I have cover crops in amongst my vegetables. So I pretty much have cover crops fairly much everywhere except where I want little bitty seeds. Like I can't have them growing when the carrots are starting and things like that. But yeah, I do.
Do you ever feel like the beds need to just be in a cover crop for a period of time and not be in vegetable production? Or do you have vegetable production in the beds every single year?
No, I have some beds that are just cover crop because, well, down there I had some beds that were just cover crop because, as I said, I grow more produce now on less land than I needed. But if this new garden, I'm not sure yet if I'll be able, I think I'll still be able to have some smaller beds this year just in cover crops for the whole year. But it's going to take me a little while figuring out because it's a new garden of how rich the soil is yet. It's going to take a little while.
Mm-hmm. So when you sow cover crop seed, how do you keep the seed from being eaten? Presumably by birds and rodents.
I use the native philosophy, indigenous people philosophy of planting more than I need because I plant, then I know they're going to get eaten by the rodents and by the birds, and some will rot and feed the fungus. And, you know, it's just life.
Mm-hmm.
I do if the robins are especially bothersome because they're looking for worms. So they're not really eating the seeds, but they make a mess. So sometimes I'll put them down, I'll throw, put the cover crop down, and then I'll throw a piece of agrobon, rime, what do you call it? That white stuff over it for a couple of days until they germinate. And then, you know, when they're an inch or two tall, the robins can't disrupt them as much.
Mm-hmm. Great. So this is a, I don't even know how to pronounce this, but can you say anything about hugelkultur?
Yes, I can.
Acoustic biomass adding nutrients to soil.
I can. I have not done a traditional hugelkultur, which I'm not going to get into because I've never done it. But it's basically using larger pieces of wood and branches and then putting soil and compost and planting right in it. It's a fabulous if you have that material on hand to use it up. I feel like when I started by cutting the trees at soil level and building up, hugelkultur wasn't out and about at that point to know about. But so I hauled the branches off. If I had known, I could have used them. But the roots were going down into the soil and the stumps were still there. And they were there for a good 10, 15 years. And I just worked around them. But as they decomposed, they were doing all the same things that any decomposing root will do. Plus they're fungal. So
Great. Is it okay to mulch with plain old dried leaves, not shredded?
I have done it and I don't find it as good because they kind of layer and mat and then they prevent moisture from going through and it takes a lot longer for them to decompose. So if you're gonna if you don't have a mower or a way to shred them, what I've done is just made a compost pile out of them and let them decompose for a couple of years and then keep taking the bottom out of it.
Mm-hmm.
Because unless you're really trying to kill something and use it as that, you know, occulting and keeping the sun and the moisture out. But otherwise, it's just like a impermeable.
Mm-hmm. Okay. This question says, which cover crops would be best to use under taller vegetables? And then it was a two-part question, something about whether red or crimson clover would be appropriate.
I'll answer the second one first. So the red clover is a perennial or a biennial, and so you're going to have it there. And like I said, if I want to plant where there's one, I just cut it off below the soil line and leave the roots in the ground and plant whatever I wanted there. But if I don't need that space, it can have it. The crimson clover, from what I've read, is winter kill, and so that could be, I would use that as part of a cover crop, but I wouldn't be putting the red clover in my cover crop. They're just here because they like me, or whatever. And the first part was, remind me, please, Kate.
Sure. It was about other cover crops for taller vegetables.
Oh, I don't think it matters as long as you wait until that crop is fairly mature. Like come August, you know, my permanent beds of asparagus, you know, I've mulched and put a layer of fresh compost and then mulched every spring. But about August, I could throw in my cover crop that's going to winter kill, and that will come up through. And again, it's not competing, it's coming up through the same. As long as you let your crop get big enough, you can use, I would, you know, that sorghum gets big pretty fast. You might not want to put that in with your corn or with a tomato or a pepper because it will get out of hand.
Okay, great. Where do you recommend getting soil tests?
I have a hard time with soil tests because they always drive me crazy. But NOFA uses Logan Labs, and we have one of our staff members helps interpret them.
Mhm.
So again, on the NOFA website would have it. The thing with Logan Labs, they do it for living soil, whereas many of the other labs will take your soil and they shake it up in water and then they analyze it, and that what they're analyzing is the minerals that are there, but not the minerals that are bioavailable to your plants. And somehow Logan Lab does a different test that comes up with what you really are able to use. And so if I were to recommend, I would probably recommend that, but I'm not sure I'm allowed to.
But you just
I
did.
don't get any kickback, so.
All right, great. Um, what would be an ideal cover crop to follow garlic?
Well, that one you saw was a mix of everything I had as you know, I can repeat them all or they're on that slide.
Yeah. All right. There was a question about ticks, whether or not this method of gardening helps promote ticks, and what you can do about that if it does.
Probably it does because it promotes voles and voles. I'm not sure, but what mice I know have ticks. I have gotten ticks in my garden. It's just, but I live in the woods, so I get ticks whenever I'm out and about. So it's just, do tick surveillance on your body all the time.
Yep.
I think, the benefits of healthy soil and healthy food far outweigh in the climate that what the energy it takes to look at our bodies and make sure that we don't have one. I know it's a terrible disease, and I've had it a couple times. So go
Mm-hmm.
ahead.
Yep. What would you do for dense clay soils in a very windy place? If I seed on top, the seeds blow away.
Oh wow, it is getting windier and windier, isn't it? Um, I would say if you have a layer um, of some kind of soil or compost that you could seed into and shuffle your seeds in with a rake, and then put a mulch on top of, if you have hardwood chips. What I do is get a, a load of wood chips delivered a year ahead of time or two, and let the mycorrhizae run through it, so when you go to use it, it's just full of white mycelium you can see. But anyway, even if you don't, you could put wood chips on top or straw, so something to keep the seeds covered so they don't blow away. Your straw will blow away. So maybe some of the remay over it, and then water it really well until they get germinated. I don't have clay soil, so I don't know, but I do know that some of those roots will go through it if you get help them.
All right, great. I think we have time for about one more, and I'm trying to find a quick one. We've got some run-on questions here. How about cover crops among and you mentioned clover, but are there other things that you might put in between the beds where you walk?
Okay, out for a minute. I didn't hear the whole question. Was it what cover crops to use in the path?
Right. Yeah. If there's anything you mentioned, clover, besides clover that might be good for the paths.
The clover is good because you can walk on it, and you're not really killing it. Whereas if you walk on oats or buckwheat, you're going to kill it because you're just crimping the stem, and then they can't get fluid. So
Mm-hmm.
either that or mulch.
Yep. And then the last question was about raspberries, whether there's something that goes well with raspberries.
Well, I'm not the fruit person. Ice cream goes really well with raspberries. You mean a cover crop?
Right.
Yeah. I would say it depends. Are they spring raspberries? Are they fall raspberries? Are they everbearers? So there's all kinds of things to think about. And again, you don't want it to be competing. So if you have fall berries, you could have some in some. You're going to have to keep trimming them back so that they're not competing. And if they're spring bearers, then after they bear, you could put in a cover crop, and it wouldn't matter if it grew up and competed a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not actually a fruit person, so I can't really speak to it fully.
Okay, that's fair. All right, well, thank you so much, Sharon. This has just been so informative and enjoyable to see your wonderful slides and have you share your wisdom with us.